don't know how many times I've introduced our first speaker now. It's coming up for 4 or 5 times. And I never run out of superlatives because each time he brings a fresh perspective. I've only heard a bit about what Tony Vickers-Byrne will be sharing with us. But let me say, he has a depth and breadth of experience in the space of human resources that is almost second to none. He's going to share from that experience. He's going to share and offer us some of his insights. He's got a particular way of doing that. So listen and hear what's being said, because I'm sure you will walk away with some real gems that you can apply in your workplace. Over to my friend, Tony Vickers-Byrne.
Thank you so much, Rob. Is that okay to hear me? Yeah?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Lovely. And is the screen showing? Fantastic. Thank you so much. And thanks for those kind words, Rob. And I always enjoy being involved with Dods and when you're sharing. It's a challenging, it's a fun, it's an emotional session, and delighted to be here. And Grace will know well that I'm looking to move to Ireland, probably next March or April. My mum was Irish and my wife's Irish, and I've got 2 young grandchildren living in Dublin, and we need to go over there and do our bit for them. And I'm looking forward to it. And I'm now half Irish, half English. I've got joint nationality, and I was watching the rugby, and I still support England against Ireland. Sorry about that, Grace, but I do. And I was watching the rugby on Saturday at Twickenham, and after the national anthems, the people were invited to take the knee. And from the England rugby team, there were 4 people who didn't, and a number of them have spoken out and saying that they can't associate themselves directly with the Black Lives Matters movement. And you know, I respect that, you know, that they have a rationale, and they feel that their religious beliefs, for example, override that. What really surprised me was that none of the Irish team took the knee. And so I did a little bit of research, and some of the Irish footballers have been taking the knee, but none of the Irish rugby union players. And I'm not going to make any comments about the reasons why. You know, all I will say is it looked strange. It really stood out. And this time last year, if a number of people had knelt down in a British and UK and British Isles sporting arena and taken the knee, people would have thought that was strange. And now it's the reverse. If you don't take the knee, it stands out. So I do think we need to keep taking the knee until it becomes the absolute norm, that the organisation, that the sporting association, that the committee or whatever truly do believe in the importance of real equality across their areas of influence. So looking forward to going to Ireland and see what I can do to help over there. But it'll be fascinating, and it'll be a whole different culture, and some things better and some things not so good. And there's a picture of Lewis Hamilton. I remember Lewis Hamilton when he first burst onto the scene in the early 2000s, and he was seen as a little bit flash. You know, he used to wear the diamond earrings, and he had a pussycat doll girlfriend, and everybody realized what his talent was, how talented he was, how fast he was as a driver. But the press and media seemed to gloat a little bit when he made a mistake. I remember in the final Grand Prix in Brazil, in Interlagos, where he needed to just finish 4th to win the World Championship, and he came off at a wet corner. And it was almost, I told you so. Well, what do you expect? And Lewis, over the course of the following 12 years, has won the world title 7 times, and is now probably the country's greatest ever sportsman, and still awaiting his knighthood. He got an OBE, but never had a knighthood. And I was looking through the motor racing drivers who've received knighthoods in the past. Jackie Stewart, the Scottish driver who won the World Championship 3 times, he got a knighthood. Stirling Moss, the great romantic English driver of the late 50s and early 60s, he got a knighthood and he never won the World Championship. So the rumours are that Lewis is now going to be knighted in the New Year's honours. Just wondering why it's taken so long. I'm just wondering why Marcus Rashford got an MBE. I was expecting him to be honoured, but I was hoping it was going to be higher than an MBE. And I think we still need to look at the way in demonstrations of public recognition that all people in this country are treated equally. And Marcus was delighted that he got his MBE, and he was, effusive in his praise for the recognition. But I was disappointed. I thought he was going to get more. And I think Lewis will get a knighthood, and well deserved. And Lewis won the 2021 annual Power List for Black people in the UK. And this year it was honouring people who have spoken truth to power. And Lewis talks about his greatest achievements being how he is challenging diversity in Formula One and how he can use his role as a real role model for the country to actually ensure that equality permeates every part of society. And when I looked through the list, I was delighted to see at number 2, this chap. This handsome gentleman is Kevin Fenton, Professor Kevin Fenton. I had the privilege of working with at Public Health England, and Kevin was the Director of Wellbeing at Public Health England before moving on to Southwark as its Director of Public Health, and now he's back in PHE as the Regional Director for London. And Kevin has worked with Obama. He's been a huge statesman for Public Health England across the whole of the country. He's one of the best speakers I've ever seen, and it was brilliant to see Kevin recognised as the second most influential person. Kevin was the author of the report that was commissioned about the impact of COVID on BAME communities, and he's followed that up with a whole range of surveys and questionnaires to actually speak to individuals and to really understand the impact that COVID has had and to identify the reasons why the BAME population was so adversely affected and to make sure that we don't make those mistakes again. So brilliant to see him as number 2. And next one, guys. And number 3, Stormzy, who has been providing out of his own pocket scholarships for young Black people to go to Cambridge. At the last presentation I did on this, I mentioned about University Challenge, hardly seeing any Black students on University Challenge. And I've been watching this series as well, and again, very, very few Black students there. And Stormzy is determined he's going to actually level that playing field, and he's going to be, again, like Lewis Hamilton, a spokesman for his community to ensure that equality comes through. And if you look through the other people on the list, people like Dame Donna Kinnear from the RCN, Jacqueline McKenzie, Director at the Centre for Migration Advice, David Olozogo, the historian, that these are people who wouldn't normally appear in an influential list. This year it's been about that speaking truth to power, but the only business person perhaps that you'd see on that list is Richard Iferenta, who's the Vice Chair of KPMG. I think if you were to look at a South Asian influential list or a white UK influential list, the majority of people would be politicians or would be business leaders. So I think that the Black community still has a long way to go, but the people who've appeared here have used their status in different industries to make real effective change, and all credit to them, and the start of that journey for real equality. Next one, Grace, please. I've shown this slide before, and these are Black nurses applauding their colleagues, applauding patients during the first lockdown, and the impact that COVID has had on those now is indisputable. That clearly the frontline workers, many of whom were from a BAME background, had a terrible first wave in terms of death and long COVID and real illness. And let's hope now that those figures are reduced dramatically in the second wave, and that there's a real recognition as well of the importance of frontline. Next slide, please. And views are split about whether COVID was racist. Lady Lawrence, Stephen Lawrence's mum, now a Labour peer. This has been generations in the making. The impact of COVID is not random, but foreseeable and inevitable. The consequence of structural injustice, inequality, and discrimination that blights our society. And a different view, sorry, let me just go back. Thanks, Chris. A different view is from the government's recently appointed expert advisor on ethnicity and COVID, Dr. Raghibali. Structural racism may not be a reasonable explanation by itself for Black and South Asian people's greater risk of illness and death. The problem with focusing on ethnicity as a risk factor is it misses the very large number of non-ethnic minority groups, so whites basically, who also live in deprived areas and overcrowded housing and with high-risk occupations. Now, doubtlessly, Lady Lawrence and Raghibali both want to achieve equality, but they're coming at it from a different perspective. And I certainly am not authoritative enough or know enough to basically say which of those is 100% right. There's a blend, but quite clearly, the social conditions, the societal conditions do seem to be having a significantly detrimental effect on BAME populations. And this has been, like nothing else, I think, over the course of the last year, a call for action. Next slide, please. And I mentioned that Marcus had missed out on the top 10. Again, I was a little bit surprised about that, but I am biased. And I come from Wythenshawe, where Marcus was born in Manchester. And the difference between Marcus and myself, and there are many differences, but one of them is that he never forgot that he came from Wythenshawe, and the support that his mum and his family and his friends and his neighbours gave to him to allow him to get the food he needed to be a great young footballer and to attract the attention of Manchester United when he was 11 and 12. And you know, he's determined he's going to give things back. And every time I see Marcus, not just on the football field, but when he's talking so passionately and eloquently about his challenge and the things he's going to continue to do, it fills me with total pride. I'm just so happy for his mum and Marcus that again, he's getting the recognition that he deserves. Next slide, please. So, some of the research that's been published very recently, September 2020, the Institute of Public Policy Research, and these are the non-health impacts of the COVID-19 epidemic on BAME populations, but which will, I suggest, lead into health issues. So people from a BAME background are twice as likely to expect to have difficulty paying their usual bills and expenses in the next 3 months. They're more than twice as likely to have lost their jobs or stopped paid working during the crisis. And also 50% more likely to be renters than the wider population. And there's been quite a few emergency mortgage holidays. So BAME populations, again, more likely to be financially disadvantaged because they're renting accommodation rather than owning accommodation. Next slide, please. Prince's Trust survey, again in September 2020. And this is the impact on younger people, particularly those from poorer backgrounds, of COVID. 44% say they'd lower personal aspirations due to COVID, and 50% of respondents from poorer backgrounds say that their goals now seem just impossible to achieve. And these are people who are well educated, who have got aspirations, who are supported by their families, but just cannot get onto the career ladder. 38% feel they'll never succeed in life. I mean, how dispiriting. People between 18 to 24 with 50, 60, 70 years ahead of them. And over a third feel they'll never be successful. And 48%, almost half of people from poorer backgrounds, basically saying they're not going to be successful. 28% believe they'll have to take any job they can get. My son up in Liverpool really struggling to get any form of job after finishing university. Really disappointed when he doesn't get shortlisted or selected for jobs in supermarkets, filling shelves. And he's up there and he's going to struggle and he's going to get something eventually, but he's really had to change his aspirations. Next slide, please. And the Resolution Foundation, which has been very active and public during COVID, surveyed 6,000 people, and twice as many young and non-white British workers lost their jobs after furlough compared to the average. And only a third of the young workers let go have been able to find work. And many, many of those will be BAME, young people who are particularly disadvantaged through being young and being BAME background. Next slide, please. So what are we going to do about it? If you'd have asked me that question 2 years ago, I would have always talked about the importance of diversity staff networks. When I was at Public Health England, we made a conscious decision that we were going to invest real power in diversity staff networks, get them to develop the action plan, provide them with executive support, provide them with somebody like me to help them go through the barriers and work through the various bureaucracy and so on, but give real responsibility to their diversity networks to run the agenda. And they don't appear on the front page of those initiatives which are in organisations with lower quartile ethnicity pay gaps. And the one which is massively ahead of all of the others is executive sponsorship. So this is somebody actually taking an individual under their wing, excuse me, and actually opening doors for them, putting them forward, mentioning them in discussions. And I remember when I was at CIPD just before I retired from full-time work in March, and we produced a report on the things and actions that should take place to have real equality in race. And there was a big split discussion about executive sponsorship. A lot of HR people who we spoke to across the country didn't like the idea of executive sponsorship. They felt it was unfair. They felt that there was a danger that people would just sponsor people in their own image, that it was a very unlevel playing field to have executive sponsorship. And when I speak to BAMA leaders about executive sponsorship, is it required? And the CIPD's position in that report, based on feedback from its members, all of them cannot believe that the CIPD members were saying this. They feel that that's what benefits most white new leaders, but it's not available to BAME future leaders. And so that level playing field is going to be even more unlevel as a result of not engaging with executive sponsorship. And I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I'm saying it happens. It happens. So if BAME future leaders are not benefiting from that, it's going to be further detrimental. And the figures that came through from HR Data Hub in 2020 show just the relative impact of executive sponsorship, twice as impactful as other issues that we all think are really important, like ethnicity data collection, targeted advertising, inclusion audits, leadership programs, diversity targets, internships. All of those things in practice don't seem to have the same sort of impact as something as let's say, brutal in terms of a action as executive sponsorship, somebody identifying somebody who they're going to support and look after and get promotion. Next slide, please. And these are the most relevant initiatives in organizations where the ethnicity pay gap is high. And I mentioned about internal diversity networks, the things that I had said were the most influential. And in fact, they seem to have the least impact. And I know that that Dods have run events about diversity networks. What I'm fascinated to see is the difference between a diversity network which is set up just to go through the motions. We've set up a diversity network because that's the norm. If we don't set up a diversity network, we would seem to be an outlier. But how many of those diversity networks really, really have power and accountability? And Duncan Selby, the previous chief executive of CIPD, was really, really encouraging the chairs of those diversity networks to meet with him personally, not with me there or anybody else from the senior leadership, but to hear directly from the chairs of the diversity networks what were the challenges, what worked well, what we needed to improve. And within a day of those meetings, you knew that you would get an email to the whole of the leadership team saying, these are the things that have come up, these are the things I want you to do, leaders, to actually level that playing field. So if you've got that sort of a culture where diversity networks are part of the executive decision making, then yes, I think my former thoughts are the same. But the reality about the impact of most diversity networks is that they are not influential in things like reducing the ethnicity pay gap. And I'm sure that rolls across most areas of diversity. Next slide, please. And again, things which we feel should be doing well, should have an impact: capturing recruitment data, pay gap transparency, reverse mentoring. Again, many organizations, and I've worked in reverse mentoring and learned so much from a young person from the Ministry of Defence, and as a result of that got involved in supporting people from the armed forces who were returning and who had significant mental health issues caused by their service. So I found it beneficial, but the evidence seems to be that reverse mentoring yet hasn't shown whether it has an impact or not. So again, I think this is a really useful list to test our assumptions and to say, if these work well, great. If they don't work well, no impact or even a negative impact. Next slide, please. And Tomorrow's Company was one of the casualties of COVID. It stopped operating, but I'm still delighted to talk about its work. Tomorrow's Company was basically a movement where an organisation, a think tank, would get organisations together to stand as one and talk about the importance of mental health in the workplace, and particularly financial well-being. And the research that they produced in 2019, many of these statistics will be known to you. But this was before COVID. 4 million people in work in the UK living in poverty. Definition of poverty: £195 per week for a single parent to bring up 2 kids, to include accommodation costs and school costs in terms of school uniforms, books, school meals. £195. 4 million people below that poverty line, and primarily working in wholesale and retail, human health and social work, accommodation, food service. These are the frontline staff that we used to applaud at 8 o'clock on a Thursday. These are the people working and still in poverty. Majority of them women, working in cleaning, cashiering, care, catering and clerical work. Many of those frontline. 61% of all low-paid workers women. Almost 3 million kids in poverty in working households. So not on universal credit, in working households. 90% of single parents are women. And that's over 6 million people living in that poverty zone, and all it takes is for a broken fridge or a washing machine, and you're pushed below the poverty line. And you've got no option to actually have a payday loan and push yourself into poverty for months or even years. And even before COVID, people across the country were identifying that money worries were a bigger cause of stress than health, relationships, or career. And we all know the massive impact that COVID's had on particular groups across the country. Next slide, please. So we've been trying to do something about it through the National Forum for Health and Wellbeing at Work. It's set up by Professor Sir Carey Cooper. Carey is the president of the CIPD, and he's Professor of Organisational Psychology at Manchester University. Carey himself, as an immigrant, came over in about 1940 from Eastern Europe, and basically is now thoroughly embedded into Manchester and the UK, and you'll often see Carey on the red sofa at BBC Breakfast News talking about the importance of well-being. And he put together this group of senior organisations. So you've got John Lewis, Glaxo, Fujitsu, Barclays, Cabinet Office, Public Health England, Royal Mail, Shell, Tesco, Twitter, Microsoft. So these are the medical directors and the HR directors and wellbeing directors of these big organizations. And we produce guides and we produce toolkits and we publish the real important things about health and wellbeing. Next slide, please. And so some of the topics that we've covered, Compassionate Work was the first major production that we did, a toolkit that is now used by the police and by the army in particular to be absolutely key to the values of their leadership development. I'll talk a little bit more about compassion as we go through. The role of line managers and the health of their employees, multi-generational workforce on health and well-being. We've seen the impact of multi-generational households on the spread of COVID. Supporting SMEs, so many people in the country work in small organisations, and how can we look after them and get them the resources they need? And we've just produced a new financial wellbeing guide, which again is on the websites and is aimed at all organisations, be they big or be they small, to be aware and to look after what needs to be done to support their most vulnerable people. Next slide, please. There's the wellbeing guide. If you just Google that, it's our Alliance Manchester Business School Financial Wellbeing Guide, and that will come through. And it's about 13 or 14 pages, deliberately short, but with lots of links to find out how you can do your bit to look after the people who you're responsible for. And, Peter Cheese, the CIPD Chief Executive, is a member of the group as well. And Peter talks about the importance of leaders looking after their staff, looking after the welfare of their staff. He's been talking about this for years. And he came from Accenture, one of the biggest accounting organizations in the world. And he basically realizes the most important thing for every leader is not the bottom line, it's not the balance sheet, it's not keeping the shareholders happy. It's about looking after the welfare of their staff. And financial well-being, I think, has been a real Cinderella part of that. But now, and particularly the impact it has on BAME populations, on women, it's absolutely core business. Next slide, please. So the actions that we're saying in that financial wellbeing report are actions which we should be taking across all parts of management. Understanding the data, understanding how our actions can actually be impacting upon employees, opening up about things, being authentic, being vulnerable, talking about your own financial issues. Many people who earn decent salaries have got significant financial issues because of the commitments that they've made. Leading the way by actually demonstrating on a regular basis that employers are going to look after all aspects of their people's well-being. And to ensure that the plans are based on the needs of the employees, have that real input from people, and not just, we think this will be good for you, and celebrating that success. So those 5 actions, could apply to any form of organizational change, leadership development, diversity initiative. They're just key things. Thanks, Chris. So one of the things that I think, with my limited knowledge and my privileged background that I've had through my life, one of the things that I think really work, I think the most important one is leading by example. I can't work for a manager who I don't have respect for. I just can't. I can't work for somebody who doesn't speak out and say, these are the things that are good and these are the things that are bad. So organizations now need to speak out on the improvements needed. Their chief executives and their senior leaders need to be seen to be human. And I think the COVID has expressed that like no other time. And building managers' confidence in dealing with race and ethnicity in the workplace. I mean, we've expected managers to just get on with things and look after medical experiments, or look after financial processes, or look after logistics supply. That's what was seen to be a good performer. But now we need to build their confidence. We need to take stock on a regular basis about how our actions are happening. And it's not just the norm. Is that such and such organization's done this. If we do this, we're going to improve as well. It may be totally different, as the work from HR data showed. Being available for people, getting to understand them, getting to trust them, getting to know them as individuals, and giving that real power to staff networks, not just setting up something to tick the list. And that employee engagement will flow from that. But it's not just a one-off thing. It's about ensuring that it's on a regular, ongoing basis. And, talked about the importance of coaching, learning and development, and internal and external talent pipelines, but they have to be fair, they have to be transparent, they have to be equal. They have to identify where the shortages are, where the skill gaps are, where the learning is, and actually fill that from across the world, and particularly in this digital age. And that flexible working and the trust that's been developed over the last 8 months is key. I was talking recently to a board at a large teaching hospital who said the biggest issue that they faced at was having to put back in place the machinery that was taken down during the first wave, that they had to trust staff in a way that they never had to before. It just wasn't able to have the bureaucracy and the financial and HR stringency and oversight that organizations are often working under. And surprise, surprise, the organization flourished, but now stakeholders and other parts of external society were actually asking for those restrictions and bureaucracy to be put back in, and the staff were rebelling against it, and understandably. And they were really concerned because they knew in their heart of hearts that the organization operated better without that rigid structure, but the external people wanted to put that rigid structure back. Next slide, please. So, mentioned compassion before, and one of the first things that we did at the National Forum was produce a compassionate work toolkit used by the police and the army and a number of other organisations across the world. And Andy Rhodes, who's the Chief Constable for Lancashire, and he's the wellbeing champion for the whole of the police force. Andy's a good man. And he talks about how he uses compassion and how he describes it to his police officers. And he wants them on a Friday afternoon, despite the trauma of their week, despite the terrible things they've seen, despite the support they've had to provide to a whole lot of people who may have lost loved ones, who found out things about loved ones that they weren't aware of. On the Friday afternoon, after a busy week at work, he wants that police constable, when they're on the doorstep, to be just as compassionate as they were on the Monday morning. I think it's a really strong message. You know, you can have compassion fatigue. I just haven't got enough strength to be kind and nice to people. I've been trying my hardest and I keep falling over. Well, keep trying. You know, as Rob said, none of us are perfect. We make mistakes all the time. But if you actually start thinking about the importance of kindness as a key human virtue, not only amongst your families, but in the workplace, it has an effect on you. You change. It certainly happened to me getting involved in this. It made me more conscious when I wasn't being kind and compassionate, and made me stop in my tracks and to try to get back onto the right way. Next slide, please. Those 4 components of compassionate leadership. Again, you know, these are a script for any good leader, any good business model. Attend, be there for your teams. Actually understand what they're going through in the same way that Kevin spoke to so many people from BME communities about the impact on them. Not just from his huge experience, he actually was there. And he was listening to them. He was actively listening. It's a real key management skill. And so many leaders who are feeling a little insecure, they need to talk rather than listen. And empathizing, you know, again, just really to be able to have the brain space to understand the impact this is having on people who you're expecting to contribute, you're expecting to perform well. And unless you can understand and realize what's going on in their day-to-day lives, you're never going to be able to do that effectively. And that's where the problems start, because of that lack of communication, that lack of understanding. And when you've got that empathy and you understand the situation that somebody's facing, then you're able to take the right intelligent action. And I don't think that's soft. I don't think that's pink and fluffy. I just think it's good business, as well as the right thing to do, being human. Next slide, please. And Jacinda is now, I think, generally seen as the greatest leader in the world. There she was on time. Knows by our deeds, which was a suffragette saying. Emily Pankhurst used to talk about knowing us by our deeds, not just talking, it's about action. And beside Jacinda there is Nanaya Mahuta, who's the first minister in New Zealand to wear the traditional chin tattoo, the moko kaya. And there's been an amount of criticism from people in New Zealand about why a foreign minister, key ambassador for New Zealand, would be allowed to be there representing New Zealand with a chin tattoo. And thank goodness, the amount of impact that that's had, and the amount of people saying this is just ridiculous. How can we talk about things like this in 2020? Has proven how Jacinda's message to her team of 5 million has made a real impact. And if we look at Kamala Harris as well, and the increasing number of women of colour and women of different ages across world leaders, and the impact that they've had on their country's COVID response, the impact they've been able to have on balancing business and public health, doing the right thing, and getting the support of their nations to follow what needs to be done. I think it sends out a real message about the future of leadership across the world. And next slide, please. And again, my favourite slide. I saw Patrick Hutchinson actually being interviewed on Good Morning Britain by Piers Morgan the other week. And Piers had actually championed Patrick when he rescued the counter-demonstrator at the Black Lives Matter protest in Waterloo in June. And this image went viral. And Patrick was there being interviewed, hugely self-confident, very charismatic, well-dressed, and promoting his new book. And I was delighted that because of his actions of humanity and courage, regardless of the political inclinations of the person who's rescuing her, that he got what he deserved. He got a position where he could speak his voice, he could write a book, it could be promoted, he could have a little bit of executive sponsorship from peers. And let's hope that that resulted in more book sales for a good person. Thanks, Al.
Wow. Thank you so much, Tony, for all of that. I've made so many notes myself, and I don't want to take MC's prerogative by diving in with my own question. So I'm going to give way to our participants and invite those questions. Grace, just a quickie. Are we going to go exclusively via Slido, or are we going to invite questions via the chat?
Via the Q&A, please.
Oh, via the Q&A.
Yeah, exactly.
Let me pop on. I've just noticed that's there. That's not always available on Zoom, but it is there. Have you had any come through, Grace? You're on mute at the minute. I don't know if you flicked yet.
Sorry. Not quite yet.
Not quite yet. Me neither. Well, as our participants are forming their questions, do pop them through, folks. I've got it on the screen ready to read out, and you can get ahead of me. Let me just pick up a conversation with Tony as we move towards our first comfort break, which will be at 10:15. So hold on if you can. Let's just take some time with Tony. Tony, there's so many aspects of what you've presented there that I personally would want to take a look at, and you and I can catch up offline, and I'll do that via LinkedIn with you later. But I wanted to pick up towards the end of your presentation, Tony. You talked about this aspect of compassionate leadership. I've been doing a bit of work in this area as well, so it's a bit of a bias on my part by homing in on that, because there's so much of your presentation we could talk about. But I noticed on the slide you showed about the Compassionate Leadership Toolkit, it was dated 2017.
Yeah.
And so I wondered, were you around long enough, given that that was 3 years ago? Are you able to share with participants anything by way of outputs or benefits or tangible pluses to the introduction of compassionate leadership? Because it's still a relatively new approach, isn't it?
Yeah, but if you listen to politicians now talking, they use the compassion word regularly.
Yeah.
And it's a bit like, you know, taking the knee has kind of developed the credibility and the vision for Black Lives Matters. And if you get somebody talking about compassion at a senior level, it'll have one of two things. It'll either get people to be more interested in it, or think the person's just doing it because it sounds good.
Yeah.
And you know, when I see some people who I know, and business leaders I know, and some politicians, when they use the compassion word, it makes me shiver, because unless they're having a total sea change in the way they operate, then I know it's just they're saying the right thing.
Yeah.
And so the issue is action. I mean, you know, the thing we always talk about, Jacinda, you know, the famous image of her hugging the Muslim person after the Christchurch terrorist attack.
I remember it. Yeah.
It went all over the world. It was in Dubai, and it was on the Berg, and everywhere. But the true action that she took, and the thing which I think makes it totally stand out, was about a couple of weeks later in the New Zealand Parliament. She changed legislation by 119 to 1 votes. They banned semi-automatic rifles.
Yeah.
So she understood the impact of this, but she was determined to take that tough action. Yeah. And you know, she describes herself as a kind but tough leader. And the impact that she's had by the early close down, by the rigid implementation across New Zealand of COVID regulations, has meant that the country has performed right at the top. Yeah. But that was through toughness, but she managed to actually make things happen because of the way she operates and her track record. So if somebody talks about compassion and they are clearly just saying that, then it's a detrimental impact. Yeah. And you know, I think that in those organizations which are really, really at the front end, you know, the police, the armed forces, and increasingly the NHS. The NHS was slow to get off on this. I've heard non-executive directors talk about, you know, why are you wasting our time talking about compassion? If I'd have been compassionate, I would have never have got to the top in a financial organisation as a black woman and be able to actually now be on the board of a trust. And, you know, I said, well, just look at your mission statement. And if you're saying you're not going to provide compassionate care for people, then change your mission statement and be open. But I bet you won't. But if you don't change it, then you've got to behave that way. You've got to be a role model. You're a senior leader. And if you're part of this organisation, you're going to be supportive and kind to make the right decisions, which could be tough ones, for your people. You've got to understand your people. You've got to be respected by them. You've got to be known by them. You've got to listen to them.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. The component parts of compassionate leadership. Thanks for that response, Tony. We've got a few questions that have come in. Let me just rattle them off and see what you want to pick up, Tony. So pen and paper at the ready if you want to just jot these down. I'll give you a summary of the question and hope I represent my colleague accurately. In the order I've seen them come in, okay. Tony, do you have any advice on how we can educate individuals in the workplace who do not want to be educated and are stuck in their ways? So something there about the kind of pushback, the kind of stubbornness, the kind of, I've heard it termed cognitive dissonance, the kind of refusal to accept. Hold on to that thought, Tony. I know you've got a response to that. Let's see if we can squeeze another one in. That was anonymous, by the way. Jill Brennan asks this: the HR research on impact of initiatives was particularly interesting. Where can I find more information about this? Also, how can executive sponsorship be effective without a receptive audience within the business as a whole? So a little bit of a link back there to the question on reluctance and denial. And there is a link to another question here about executive sponsorship. Tony, can you expand on executive sponsorship in the support of Black educators? That again is anonymous. So just Jill giving her name there about further information on HR initiatives and executive sponsorship. I don't know if you want to wrap up there, Tony, with a response to all of those before we take over.
Thanks, Sam. So this first one was about how to deal with people who don't want to learn, who don't want to change their ways. And 2 or 3 years ago, I'd have said, well, isolate them. Yeah, probably say 5 years ago, I'd have said isolate them, go around them. You know, promote people who've got the right values and let them realise that they're, you know, kind of cutting off their nose to spite their face. I wouldn't give that advice now. I think that if you're going to do that, you are not being an effective, inclusive leader. They think about things that way because of their experiences, or because of their home situation. You know, why are they resisting this? You know, why are they resisting something which most people would see is fair and right thing to do? So spend the time with the individual to understand why they are recalcitrant about this, why they won't actually put themselves forward for this, why they don't want to actually learn. And by having that discussion, I'm sure a whole lot of stuff will come out, which will develop trust and which may well change that individual for the better. Clearly, at the end of this, if they're saying, sorry, I'm not going to behave like this, I'm not going to, you know, live to those values, well, that's fine. Then they leave the organisation.
Yeah.
Give them the opportunity, reach out to them to see if we can actually change their ways. Impact of the initiative on CIPD. If you just go onto the CIPD website, it's an open report. It's not behind closed doors. And just look at impact, look at equality and diversity. You'll find it on there. It was produced in October last year, so it's about a year old. Lots and lots of good stuff in there. But that one thing about executive sponsorship, you know, caused dissonance between the report and particularly business leaders.
Great stuff.
You know, executive sponsors, you know, the problem is that if you don't have significant numbers of BAME people at the top of organisations, then who opens these doors? Who looks after people and supports them with real talent? And it's people like me. You know, it's people from a non-BAME background who actually have to really understand the importance of fairness in an organisation and doing the right thing and developing talent. And you know, I was lucky living in London and working in London to be able to have the benefit of working with people from a whole range of different groups and just seeing so many young, talented BAME people. And I tried to sponsor and support. But you know, there was me and another couple of people. So it needs to be seen as an organisation. But you can make real change if you're going to do this. Yes, appoint more BAME people at senior levels. Yes, have a culture of fairness. For the interim, get more and more white leaders to support BAME people with that executive sponsorship. But it needs to happen because otherwise the divide will take place. And eventually it will balance. I mean, if you look now at the US government in terms of its diversity, it's just fabulous. You know, that's gonna roll out through society. It really is. And it'll take longer in some states than others. My goodness me, I was looking at documentaries about the Midwest yesterday, which shows the real recalcitrance there, but it will change. It will change.
Yeah.
The third one was about executive sponsorship of Black educators. I think I probably covered that in the second point as well.
Yeah, I think you did. And with one eye on the clock, there are a couple of other questions there. I know that the Dods D&I team, for all of you who have posed those questions and perhaps we didn't get to them, I noticed there was one there for me from Anonymous, so I can't call a name out in responding to you, but asking about some of those differences that BAME staff, Black, Asian, minority, ethnic, differences within that term too.
Definitely.
The question about the term, we could spend the rest of the day talking about that. We won't, because we've got some other things we're going to cover. But we will respond to your questions via the Dods D&I team. I will certainly respond to all those questions that have been put to me via the Dods D&I team after today. And so you can look out for those responses later. For now, let's just say thank you to Tony for being with us. Thank you, Tony, for all your pearls of wisdom. I, for one, will be looking back at your presentation, and I will be contacting you directly about a couple of things that are relevant to my work. For the question that fell to me, really quickly on the differences of BAME, there's a fantastic report out there called Reflections on the Labyrinth. Reflections on the Labyrinth. Type that in. It's an open source report. It talks about the differences, subtle and radical, between different ethnicities and why it is, particularly in the public sector, we need to take account of those differences if we are to provide a more equitable future for all our people. Reflections on the Labyrinth. I'll say no more. What I will say is thank you again to Tony. We're going to take a break. And I think, unless Grace tells me otherwise, we'll be back at 10:30 for our next speaker, who's going to share with us about cultural intelligence, which is actually speaking to the point just made. Tony, have a great rest of day, and thanks for being with us.
Enjoy the day. Thank you. Bye-bye.